2 out of 3 case officers in any given Cold War intelligence service never went into deep cover. You were one of them. Every so often, in a debriefing room, somebody who had known you for years would notice the file. 20 years on the payroll, not a single irreversible operational commitment on it. And they would ask the question the way somebody asks a question they are slightly embarrassed to ask. Wait, you never took permanent cover? Small pause. You watched them adjust something behind their eyes. For half a second, you became slightly suspicious, or slightly principled, or slightly stuck in the wrong directorate. They could not pick which. You shrugged, refilled the cup, moved on. But part of you noticed how surprised they were. And there is a whole psychology behind the file that never crossed the line, one that is more interesting than the institutional narrative tends to admit. Here is where you sit historically. You are the bridge category of operative. You watched the practice of permanent operational commitment shift from a Cold War backbone into something almost ceremonial. You were the first cohort of mid-career officers who could spend an entire service career inside official cover, embassy posting, diplomatic protection, analytical directorate, liaison rule. You watched siblings in the trade, same training cohort, same recruitment year, same office, start taking the permanent step. The deep cover deployment, the illegal placement, the defection in place offer, the non-official identity that could not be walked back. You sat it out. You were eligible, you were available, you were the right age, and every time the offer crossed your desk, every time the recruitment officer leaned in with the pitch, every time the operational opportunity surfaced, something in you said no, a quiet little no, almost inaudible, every time. For 30 years.
Fear is the wrong angle. You were not scared. The angle that matters is what specifically stopped your hand every single time. Because it almost did not, did it? You came close. You read the offer late one night at the station and felt something flicker. You said maybe out loud at least once. And then something inside you said, not this one. The first thing it was protecting you from was permanence. People like to say permanence as if it is a flat word that does not mean much. Your operational mind understood it differently. You are sitting across from the chief of station at 32. You are being offered a deep cover placement that once accepted becomes the entire trajectory of your career. Somewhere in the back of your head a voice asks, will you still be able to live with this when you are 58? Most officers brush that voice off. You could not. You sat there and tried to picture the 58-year-old version of yourself who had been someone else for the last 26 years. And that person was a complete stranger. You had no idea what that person believed. You had no idea what that person was going to find unbearable. You had no idea who that person reported to, or whether the service that was making the offer would still exist in the form it existed in tonight. You thought, I am not making a permanent decision on behalf of an operative I have not met. That is the psychology. Most officers do not think of their future operational self as a different person. They assume the future version is just current them with more clearance. You knew better. You had been a completely different officer at 25 than you were at 32. 58 was not going to be the exception. This is one of the quiet truths about a lot of you. You had a much more honest relationship with the idea that your operational frame changes. You watched yourself believe one thing about a target country in 1976, and then quietly stop believing it by 1984. You watched yourself swear by a particular operational doctrine, and then watch that doctrine turn into something else entirely. By 28, you had enough data on yourself to know the data was not stable. So when somebody handed you a permanent cover identity and asked you to wear it forever, you could not. Honesty was in the way.
The historical data on operatives who took permanent cover and later regretted it backs you up. Of operatives in deep cover deployments who were eventually exfiltrated or surfaced, the regret rates documented in declassified post-service debriefs consistently track higher among those who committed in their 20s than those who committed later in their careers. The 28-year-old version of you that you did not trust was statistically correct. The future operative you did not want to bind would have found the choice unrecoverable. Now, layer 2, the wave. You refused permanent commitment precisely because everybody around you was taking it. Read that again. The popularity of the practice is what triggered the refusal. Different story entirely. You watched the first wave, the illegals expansion under Yuri Andropov in the late 1960s, when the KGB's first chief directorate aggressively expanded its placements across Western Europe. A colleague came back from Moscow Center with the recruitment ask and walked around like he had been baptized. You watched the second wave, the American NOC expansion in the early 1970s, when the CIA's Directorate of Operations stood up the formal non-official cover program at scale. Then the defector in place push of the late 1970s. Then the wave of paramilitary commitments. Then the long-sustained illegal placement push that followed the 1985 wave of Soviet exposures, when Moscow Center tried to rebuild what Aldrich Ames and others had not yet burned. You watched the same operational pitch land on 3 different colleagues at the same training cohort in the same recruitment cycle. You like a good operational mind as much as anyone. Eye-rolling at the work itself is not your move. You are not that officer. You just noticed, noticing what other people in the trade are doing without joining them. You have done that your whole career. The institutional pressure toward permanent commitment was the first big test of one instinct you have. The instinct that says, if everyone in the directorate is suddenly making the same permanent choice, slow down and ask why. Pause. Watch a little longer. See where it lands. When you slowed down, what you saw was that most of these officers were taking the commitment because it was the commitment being offered this year, the placement their training cohort had taken, the legend their handler had walked them into without an alternative. A whole lot of operatives took permanent cover that was not really theirs and then called it irreversible. That made you back up. You were refusing the wave. The cover identity itself was almost beside the point.
Some part of you has always been allergic to the sentence, "Everybody in the directorate is doing it." Behavioral research on operational decision-making, documented in part in CIA's internal analytical literature throughout the 1980s, has long flagged what assessors call the cohort drift effect, the tendency of career officers to converge toward whatever permanent commitment was modeled by their training group. Your career file is one of the cleanest pieces of evidence for resistance to that drift. Layer 3. This one most analytical histories miss. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called costly signaling. A peacock grows a giant tail. A bird that survives despite the tail is announcing, "Look at how strong I am. I can afford this. I am built for it." Permanent operational commitment works the same way. A deep cover placement says, "I am committed to this service. I am willing to wear this identity forever. I am willing to put my actual life through erasure to make sure the service can see it." That is the signal. Costly, permanent, visible to your service. You sent the opposite signal. Your unmarked file is also a signal. It says, "I have not found an operational reality yet that I trust enough to wear forever. I am still listening. I have not locked in. I have not given the most permanent piece of identity I own to anything in particular." That is a signal too. Quieter, does not get attention at the directorate cocktail, but it is evidence of a real operational personality, someone who has not finalized their position, someone who is keeping a few extraction routes open, someone who watched a lot of colleagues lock in too fast. The most famous historical example of this is not a case officer, but a KGB archivist, Vasily Mitrokhin, who from 1972 to 1984 had unsupervised access to the files of the KGB's first chief directorate, began secretly copying intelligence material out of operational protest as early as the late 1950s. He had multiple opportunities across 3 decades to defect, to walk into a Western embassy, to make the visible commitment that would have ended his career inside the Soviet system. He refused. For nearly 30 years, he kept collecting. kept refusing the irreversible, visible step. When he finally did contact a Western service in 1992, he did so on his own terms, with a complete archive that had been compiled across more than 2 decades of deliberate non-commitment. According to Christopher Andrews' documentation in the Mitrokin Archive, Mitrokin's pattern of behavior, exhaustive collection paired with sustained refusal to make the visible move, is one of the most consistent patterns in the historical record of operatives who eventually contributed the most durable intelligence to Western services. He outlasted 7 KGB chairmen by simply refusing to commit visibly before the moment was right. There was another piece to this: the operational identity itself. Most officers do not talk about their operational identity as if it is a piece of property they own. They treat it as background scenery to their career. You do not. You have always quietly understood that your operational identity is the one piece of inventory that actually belongs to you, not the service. The service can reassign you, not the cover. The cover can be burned, not the legend. The legend has expiration dates. Your actual identity, the one underneath every cover you have ever worn, is the only piece of inventory that has your name carved into it from training. You do not deface inventory. You think long-term about the things that are yours. A lot of you came up around senior officers who took poor care of the operational identity that was theirs. You watched careers die from overcommitment. You watched officers absorbed by a cover identity so completely that when the operation ended, the real person was difficult to reconstruct. You absorbed a quiet rule from it. The things that are yours, you protect. You do not mark them on operational impulse. So when somebody handed you a permanent cover identity and asked you to mark your one and only operational self in service of a doctrine you might not hold next year, your operational instinct answered before your mouth did. The instinct said, "Do not touch the inventory. We have to drive this career another 20 years. Now, the part most institutional histories do not want to say out loud, the identity part. When you ask deep cover operatives why they accepted permanent placement, the most honest answer tends to be some version of, "I needed something operational to point at when somebody asked me who I was." A 2010 review of operative motivation data published through the International Studies Association Proceedings on Intelligence Careers found that a significant portion of officers who committed to deep cover identified the permanent commitment partly as a resolution of internal operational ambiguity. The cover was a signpost, a label, a way of putting a piece of operational identity outside the file where it could be seen. You never needed the signpost. Maybe you could not articulate it in fancy terms. Maybe you did not have a paragraph ready for the assessment review. You still knew which service you were in and what your operational position was. You did not need an external identity object to point at. You were not carrying an operational identity around in your hand looking for somewhere to mount it permanently. This is one of the most underrated traits in your cohort. A lot of you have a stable inner operational center that does not require external proof. You do not need to wear the foreign legend to prove your service loyalty. You do not need to post the irreversible commitment to confirm you took the work seriously. You do not need to mark the operational identity to remember which side of the line you stand on. The position is already internal. The permanent cover adds nothing. Younger generations of operatives took permanent commitments partly because the post-Cold War intelligence environment made operational identity feel slippery. The boundaries between services were blurring, the targets were shifting, the doctrines were rewriting themselves every 5 years. A permanent operational commitment was one way to nail it down, to say, at least this part is fixed, at least this part is mine. You did not grow up needing to nail it down. You came up in a service where your position was allowed to be private. Nobody outside the immediate directorate was watching. Nobody needed proof. So the file stayed unmarked.
One more piece under all of this. You have a relationship with operational regret that other generations of officers do not. Most operatives, when they make a permanent commitment, assume they will work the regret out later. They assume they can adjust, redirect, walk it back. A deep cover identity is an interesting test case because you really cannot walk it back. Exfiltration is expensive, dangerous, and incomplete. The legend tends to leave residue inside the person who wore it. A lot of you are allergic to making permanent operational decisions you cannot refine. That is a feature. You watch the trade break enough times to know the smart move is to keep room for the next adjustment. You do not want to be locked into the 25-year-old's reading of a target country. You do not want to be locked into the 25-year-old's operational doctrine. You do not want to be locked into the 25-year-old's cover commitment. You leave doors cracked. You hold on to options. You keep the extraction plan current. Plenty of operational decisions get made on time. Indecision has nothing to do with it. You just learned that anything operationally fixed is usually waiting to embarrass you later. The permanent cover is the fixed thing. You do not make fixed things lightly. That is a learned skill. Fear has nothing to do with it.
So when somebody at the directorate function says, "Wait, you never took permanent cover?" what they are really asking is, why did you opt out of one of the loudest operational commitments of our service lifetime? The long version of the answer is this. You ran a different operational algorithm than most of your cohort. You take a permanent decision seriously. You do not trust temporary career urges. You do not trust cohort enthusiasm. You do not trust the version of yourself that picked the doctrine you are currently embarrassed by. And you do not want to staple anything to your operational self that the future officer wearing this file will have to clean up. Here is the closing thought. In a service environment where everyone is announcing themselves at top volume, sleeve and legend and cover, and a foreign passport on the collarbone, you became one of the only operatives left who could still be a surprise. Somebody who has not already told everyone what they think before they speak. Somebody whose operational identity is not pre-printed on the file folder. Somebody who held back, watched the wave, ran the test, and decided the cleanest move was no move. That is a 30-year decision, a long, quiet one, and that is fine. Yeah, absolutely not weird at all. Just the particular shape of an operational mind that has never confused commitment with permanence and never confused refusal with fear.